Good evening, those watching World War II TV. I'm Paul Woodadge, and we have an interesting show coming up this evening because we're going to talk for the first time about poetry, which we haven't done before. And we have two guests with us tonight. Our man on the ground to tell the story of Lieutenant Jones is Lloyd Scott, a battlefield guide in Normandy. Good afternoon, good evening, Lloyd. Are you good?
Oh, thank you. Very good. How are you?
And then joining us in the middle of the show while Lloyd is driving between locations, we have my friend Colin Taylor coming on, who's also a battlefield guide, but also is something of a poet. He has several published books under his belt, and he'll come on to talk about war poetry and how it fits into our understanding of history and the interpretation of the events of World War II. So without further ado, we'll put the camera on Lloyd, and we'll start talking about what we're talking about today. So Lloyd, tell us where you are.
Well, I'm currently standing next to a very noisy church in the little town of Modrainville, just outside Caen. And this is a very important location for the individual that we're talking about today, Geraint Jones. This is where his TAC HQ was based in Operation Epsom.
So before we get into the circumstances of the fighting in Normandy, we're going to talk a little bit about Jones, the person, and indeed how you came to be interested in the project and what you've learned. And we should point out to our audience that you've got a Facebook page about the book you are currently researching and writing about Lieutenant Jones. So where was he from and what was his backstory before joining the military?
Well, Geraint was from Haverfordwest in Pembrokeshire in Wales, the same town that I was born in. And the reason why I'm interested in Geraint, when I first came to Normandy in 2009 with the Air Cadets, the officers had prepared a list of soldiers' graves relating to where we were all from. And we went around visiting them. And we went to see Geraint and we read one of his poems at his grave. And so that sparked my interest in Geraint. Now, the one thing that stood out at the time is that there was no photograph, or no known photograph of Geraint. And all we knew about him was the unit he served in, and he was a poet, basically. And so every year I would have a little look, I would try and find photographs, but I failed. Until this year, when we had a bit of extra time, thanks to the quarantine, I did a lot of searching and managed to come across the sweetheart of Geraint back in Pembrokeshire, her daughter. And the sweetheart had kept a newspaper clipping with a photograph of Geraint and also his last letter that he wrote from Normandy on the 22nd of June, 1944. And from then on, it just snowballed and I found more individuals, family members, soldiers he served with, and I had a huge amount of information. And so I decided to write a book. Now, Geraint, he was quite a learned individual. He went to Haverfordwest Grammar School in Haverfordwest, Pembrokeshire. That's him taking a bath in the concentration area near Cannes and Cully in Normandy after the 15th of June and before the 25th of June, 44. And after his education in Pembrokeshire, he went to Chiltern College, where he studied languages. And after that, just like his father, he went to Cambridge University, where he studied law. And he didn't get to finish because of the outbreak of war and him being called up. And so he was sent off to the Officer Cadet Training Unit and was commissioned initially into the Royal Tank Regiment. You can see him in the back row there, second from the right, with a rather large cap. And he didn't last long in the Royal Tank Regiment. He was transferred out to the 3rd Monmouthshires. And the 3rd Monmouthshires were a motorised infantry unit serving with the 11th Armoured Division. And so it was perfect pairing. He got to bring his tank experience with him. And he joined the HQ of 159th Brigade, which the 3rd Mons were within the 11th Armoured, and he became a liaison officer. So he'd be liaising with all the units between the front and the rear and TAC HQs. And so, yes,
sorry to interrupt. Did he speak French, Lloyd? The languages he learned, was he a French speaker?
I don't know that. We know very little about what he was studying. Cheltenham College, unfortunately, weren't able to give a tremendous.
It could have been Latin and ancient Greek, couldn't it?
Could have been.
You know, but
I mean, that would have matched his poetry, basically.
But as a liaison officer, there's a possibility he spoke French, which would.
Yes.
And the reason we want to do this show, folks, is that of course I'm going to be doing shows on units like the 101st Airborne and the 1st Division on Omaha Beach and the British Commandos. But it's nice to tackle something that isn't quite as well known. And the Monmouthshire Regiment, I'm sure there's some Americans watching this, and no offence, who won't have ever heard of the Monmouthshire Regiment, and that's why bringing something like this in is just a really enjoy to bring something unknown to the table there. So you explained that he was part of the 11th Armoured Division, and they're perhaps not a unit we think of immediately in terms of the Normandy battle, because they're not a June the 6th outfit. They fight later on inland, notably in things like Bluecoat and what have you. But for people who read the D-Day stories, again and again and again, the 11th Armoured Division don't come into the story. So we're not going to go too much into the depths of what they're doing, but they fit into the story you said earlier of Operation Epsom. So, we've done a little bit about Geraint's background now. In terms of the Monmouthshire Regiment, give an idea about when they came ashore and what their initial roles were in Normandy, how they got to be where you're standing now.
Yeah, sure. So the Monmouthshire Regiment, along with all other elements of the 159th Infantry Brigade, they came ashore between Juno Beach and Sword Beach. Geraint himself at Luc-sur-Mer between the 13th and the 15th of June 1944. And they immediately went from the coast inland to the Cruelly area, where they stayed in a concentration area until the start of Epsom, basically. They didn't do anything until that operation began. This was their first taste of combat. And so the photograph you showed of him taking a bath was taken in the concentration area by a man named Peter Andrews. And Peter Andrews was the senior liaison officer of 159th Brigade, and Geraint shared a slit trench with him for the majority of his time in the Normandy campaign.
Just to interrupt you, we've had one of our YouTube viewers, John Cartwright. We'll just double check, because he's been asking about David Jones. David Jones and Geraint Jones are one of the same, aren't they? That is just...
Yeah, so his name is David Rees Geraint Jones. It's very common at the time for people, especially in Pembrokeshire and Wales, not to go by their first names. And so he was known as Geraint, and Geraint was the name that he was recorded in war diaries, and that he was known to Peter Andrews by, that he was known to family members by. And
so that's just to clear it up for John watching there. David Jones, Geraint Jones, they are one and the same. It's just that, as Lloyd said, it's that era when, first name, second names, third names, initials. So Geraint David, and Geraint is very much a Welsh name, isn't it? And so that's possibly why in Commonwealth War Graves he's maybe known as David. I don't know, but anyway, they are one and the same. We've confirmed that now. So and we've got Martin Harley watching, who a Welsh viewer watching. So that's good to know. So sorry to interrupt you there. You're in the middle of your flow there, Lloyd. I shouldn't have stepped in there, but I just wanted to clear up, because I think John thought he was watching the wrong show. But we're good to go. So where were we in the story? We were just saying about them coming ashore, and I'll hand it back to you, Lloyd. I'm very sorry for interrupting the flow there.
So they spent their whole time, the early part of the Normandy campaign, in the concentration area. The 11th Armoured Division weren't doing anything. The 3rd Mons certainly weren't doing anything. And so the letters that I have of Geraint and Peter just talk about them trading with locals, trading strawberries, parts of their ration packs, giving sweets to children, just generally enjoying life. They had a couple of scares with German aircraft flying over, one that was shot down quite close, which was recorded in the war diary. But other than that, before Epsom, absolutely nothing happened.
So let's get back to where we are now, and you said there about that being TAC HQ there, and we've got some damage on the church now. So let's get back to, start with the battle story around here now. So explain where you are and what we're looking at now and how this fits into the story, and we'll talk about the circumstances of the actual push forward in the operation.
So Operation Epsom, the purpose of Operation Epsom is the first major attempt to fully secure the city of Caen and secure the high ground south of the Odon, and began on June 26th, and by June 27th, June 28th, The war diary states that around about 11:30 to midnight, 159th TAC HQ is placed here in this little piece of grass in Modrainville. Now, Modrainville is basically right in the middle of the corridor that the 15th Scottish are blasting through, hopefully pushing to the high ground known as Hill 112. So Geraint and Peter would have been in this little piece of grass here, which was an orchard back in the war, and they'd have had their vehicles. Geraint was in a Daimler Dingo scout car, and his slit trench would have been right up against the vehicle on this little patch of grass. The orchard itself did, in the war, extend through this wall over here and the houses, but of course, being so close to Caen today, it's popular real estate, and so it's all been built upon. But in Peter's letters, he mentions that when he wasn't on the wireless set, he was diving into his slit trench up against his command vehicle, because this area was receiving a hell of a lot of German artillery and mortar fire.
As is evidenced by the fact you're going to show us damage to the church. We haven't got Duncan with us on the ground looking for Spang, which is our, for those watching, Spang is our, we don't know where we came up with it, but it's our name for bullet holes and shrapnel damage to buildings, and there's lots of it in Normandy. And incidentally, in case you're wondering why I didn't get a map together, partly I completely forgot to get one together for this show, so my apologies there. But also, this is very much the second part of Operation Epsom. So the maps you can find tend to be about, as Lloyd mentioned there, other units, not so much 11th Armoured. So there's not a lot about this, but you can, I'll put links in the YouTube description so you can find this area on a map. But that's the span there, the damage there at the church. So yeah, pretty heavily whacked there.
Yeah, some pretty hefty rounds punctured into this. Lots of shrapnel. The majority of the church on the southern side is rebuilt from the war. Obviously, the church tower took quite a pounding, and most of the town is unfortunately modern today. Not a lot of old buildings here.
That's amazing stuff. So yeah, so their role in Operation Epsom was very much sort of the backup, not backup in the sense that they're not involved, but like all the operations in Normandy, they're quite complex, aren't they? So you get the assault units and backup units, and the plan is usually so one division or one brigade pushes through, then another brigade pushes through and leapfrog. And an Operation Epsom, as you said, is the first real one to try and take Caen. You know, we'll do shows on Operation Epsom in the future. The point of this show is it's not really a battlefield following a battle. We're following an individual who happened to be a poet. It's a personal story, and you know, try to do something a bit different now. So I'll hand it back to you, Lloyd, and what we're talking about.
Yes, I mean, the Third Mons were in the background. They weren't the main players. The main players, Operation Epsom, are the 15th Scottish, and the job of the 11th Armoured Division is, once the Scottish have opened up the salient to the German lines, is to plough on through, and then they would leapfrog. They would continue doing that as long as they had the advantage, which unfortunately they didn't. They didn't have the advantage because at the same time, Rommel was planning a counterattack towards the coast. And lots of German units, 1st SS, 2nd SS, 10th SS, and all sorts, and 12th SS were in the area, and they were planning to punch through the British lines all the way through the city of Bayeux towards the coast. And so we didn't have the advantage at the time, unfortunately. And also, not a lot of consideration had been taken into the road networks in the area. Many of the main arteries run east-west, and only small dirt tracks ran north-south down the actual line of attack. And so the area was heavily congested. It was a bit of a mess early on. And the Third Mons were late to arrive. And their job was rearguard, basically, especially Charlie Company, which we're going to be talking about, C Company later on in Nuon. They were the actual rearguard. And they got a little bit lost, which we'll talk about at the next location. But yes, they weren't the main players. And that's what I like about Geraint, and I like about the Third Mons, is when people write books, they always focus on the famous units, the VC winners, and those that survived the entire war. Geraint's war lasted a couple of days, and that's what I like. It's an interesting subject for me.
Absolutely. So I'm talking about your second location. Are we in the area where we can start moving on, because you're going to be driving off and putting your camera in your car? Because
yeah, sure. The sun is going down
today.
So I'll be making my way to my car, and we'll drive through some country lanes towards the little village of Mouon.
And just for those watching, this is just the way it worked out. Lloyd is doing both the presentation and the filming tonight, so bear with him the fact that he's doing everything tonight. Often I have a dedicated camera person, but it didn't work out today to have someone else there, so Lloyd is doing everything. And then when later on one of the longer drives, Colin Taylor is going to be joining us to talk about poetry generally, so that'll be on a longer drive. At the moment it's all still Lloyd, and I'll put it back once he's got his camera in the front of the car. And you'll see, for those watching, we've done this before in other shows, just Normandy back roads and villages. And you know, as if you've been in the area where we are now, the area kind of west and north of Caen, there's villages every couple of clicks, and they all look very similar, and they got the narrow lanes and the stone walls, and so just enjoy a bit of Normandy countryside. And so I'll hand back to you, Lloyd.
Yeah,
so where
sure.
are we heading for now?
We're heading towards the small village of Mouon. Now, Geraint's role as the liaison officer, he'd of course be going back and forth between the lines to see the troops and to gather information and intelligence and relay it, because we didn't have tremendous communication. Most of the communication across long distances, especially in an active operation, would be dispatch riders or liaison officers. And so on the 28th of June 1944, there was a bit of an issue at TAC HQ. Brigadier Sandy, who was in charge of the 159th, had a bit of a breakdown. And so Peter Andrews, as the senior liaison officer, had to drive Brigadier Sandy back to the rear to sort him out, basically. And so Geraint is left alone at TAC HQ in Modrainville. And as we're going to talk about in Mouon in a second, C Company of the 3rd Mons got into a bit of a situation. The Germans were counter-attacking, and they took heavy losses. And so Geraint would have been making his way out at some point on June 28th, pretty much down the road that we're driving on right now, although it has been modernized slightly, to Mouon to liaise with the troops. And unfortunately, this is where Geraint will meet his end, because the area was heavily swarmed with German soldiers that were involved in counterattacks. And poor old Geraint was hit either by a piece of shrapnel along this route, or by, as Peter's account states, a sniper's bullet. But every single rifle bullet in the war was a sniper's bullet, unfortunately. And he was mortally wounded. That didn't kill him.
Sorry,
he was mortally wounded, and he was moved to an aid station, and he later, on June 28th, died of his wounds.
And for those watching, we know, who watched some of my other shows over the course of the summer, this period at the end of June is the Allies are still really finding their feet in how to deal with the advances. And as we've said before, attacking is hard in Normandy. This is well before we get to the later operations like Spring and Totalize and Tractable, where we've learned and we're using more artillery and we're using our air power. This is still that early period where we're feeling out the enemy and they're feeling out us, and the Germans are still very much entrenched. And Epsom, you know, we're not going to talk about whether or not the operation was successful or not. If it wasn't, it was one of those early ones where it's kind of a draw in some ways, but we're not here to talk about it as a large operation. We're here to talk about one person's role in it, and that person, the fact he wrote a poem was a poet is very interesting. So you can see the influence watching of the fact we're not very far away from Caen, because this is, as Lloyd said, this is commuter belt. So the villages have been increased in size since the war, and bus routes and bus stops and things like that. But you can still see the bits and pieces of the original buildings as you drive through. But it is very much in that belt around Caen where there have been changes since the war, understandably. But this is what we're trying to do on World War II TV. This idea of bringing these things live, and we're out there on the battlefield. And Lloyd has researched this, and it's a new story. We're very pleased to bring you these kind of uniquely interesting subjects, and Lloyd has been researching on this. He's been a battlefield guide for a few years now, and one of the circuit here in Normandy. So we're happy to have you on, and your research is impressive so far.
Yeah, it's a very interesting project. it certainly kept me busy through quarantine, and no doubt will keep you busy for a lot longer. Quite interesting here, we're just coming through Torbus-Odon, and this house here, more Spang, this house has taken
there's a lot there.
Quite the battering, all up and down that machine gun fire.
Yeah.
And then we're going to be heading out towards Moulins, which is coming up shortly. This wouldn't have been the road that Geraint would have used back in 1944. This main road here would have been pretty hectic, and the houses all along the left and right wouldn't have been so close. Moulins was a lot smaller in the war, and to our left and to our right there would have been a tremendous amount of orchards and woodland that would have given tremendous cover to the Germans that were to our south. So unfortunately, that's probably where the fatal shot came from the southern side of the road that took Geraint from us.
And just for the benefit of the viewers, which way are you heading now? You're heading...
I'm heading pretty much directly east towards Caen. Maybe a little bit northeast.
Yeah, no, the John who's watching, he is talking about different David Jones. He's got where we are talking about different. He's talking about the famous war poet David Jones, 1895 to 1974. No, that's a different one. No, we are talking about different Jones then. As Martin joked, there's lots and lots of Jones in Wales. Plenty. Jones and Williams. If you shout out Jones and Williams in most Welsh towns, you'll get half the people turn around and look at you. Is that not right, Lloyd?
Yeah, pretty much. If you look at the records for the South Wales Borderers and the Third Bonds and all sorts, it's all Jones. And I don't know if you can make it out on the video because it's pretty bad quality probably, but in the distance you can see at the very end of this road, there's Caen. It's very, very close.
Yeah. So there we are. That's more like a original buildings coming up there.
Yeah, we're starting to see the original ones again. Most of these here, of course, this would have been apple orchards and little copses of trees. The Third Mons noted the area to be very difficult to navigate, and that would contribute towards them getting a little bit lost on the night of 27th to the 28th of June 44, which would unfortunately contribute towards C Company taking such heavy losses.
Well, that's one of the facts about Normandy is, I mean, not so much Calvados, the department we're in, but La Manche, which is one of many, many departments in France. It has the third longest mileage of roads in France. In the department, Calvados is very similar. Even between two villages, 2 or 3 miles apart, you can often get 2 or 3 routes parallel to each other that all go the same route or the same direction. And the map reading for officers at this point can often be quite tricky. They maybe not have the small scale maps, and errors can often be made, unfortunately, and sometimes these errors end up with the loss of life. And we see it time and time again. There's the Canadian Padre Brown just after D-Day, who possibly drove a bit too far down the line and got himself into a German ambush. These things happen. They didn't have Google Earth and Street View and that kind of thing. So and that was just Lloyd putting his camera back on his gimbal again as we come into this. So we've obviously got a town square here. So explain where we are and how this comes into the story. It's C Company we're talking about here, aren't we? The Third Mons.
Yeah, so we're in the little village of Moulins, which is now quite a large village, thanks to the city of Caen. And we're coming up against the church here, which is where C Company of the Third Mons would pretty much have their last stand on the 28th of June 1944. Now, C Company were supposed to be the rear guard, and they were held up here as the rest pushed south down towards, well, eventually Hill 112. They were going to go and cross the Odon down to the Tormanville Bridge, and C Company was supposed to be up here. And in the night of the 27th to the 28th of June, down these little narrow bocage country lanes, they got lost in the dark, and they ended up pushing way straight into of the 21st Panzer Division. And so when day broke on the 28th of June, the 12th SS and the 21st launching a counterattack A84 road, which is way over in the distance there. You can probably hear it. It used to be a railway line. And the tanks came straight into Moulins here and really caused tremendous casualties. Here, the 3rd Mons had 3 subalterns killed, so 3 junior officers, and 67 other ranks, which pretty much wiped out C Company. And you can see on the wall of the church here your bullet damage, pretty hefty bullet damage, most likely either large shrapnel or 20 millimeters from German armored cars. You got quite a chunky one.
Yeah. But we think Geraint was killed by rifle fire rather than by artillery fire.
Yes, it's difficult to say. Of course, Peter Andrews' account is that he heard his buddy had been killed by a German sniper, which was likely, given that he was traveling in a rather exposed vehicle, probably popping his head out the top to have a look at the terrain, but equally could have been killed by a piece of shrapnel. And so he was making his way here on the 28th of June to liaise with the cut-off boys of the C Company, basically.
And C Company had a really rough time. I mean, it was you know, almost not quite wiped out, but I mean, you know, it was a serious engagement, wasn't it?
Oh, definitely, yes. We've been dealing with elite and fanatical units of the 12th SS, well-tested, but at this time, worn-down units of the 21st Panzer Division. And these are only infantry units at the time on the fringes here. They didn't have any support with them. They didn't have any tanks. And so this infantry unit, yes, they suffered heavily. 67 junior ranks and 3 subalterns. And in this cemetery, actually, as well, not connected to the 3rd Mons, this is a Commonwealth war graves site. There is one Commonwealth soldier buried here. It doesn't have anything to do with this story, and was killed in July of 44. There's an artilleryman here, a gunner, which I can find if I hunt him down.
And then we should move off to the last location.
Yeah, then we'll head to Saint Manvieux. As of yet, I don't know this guy's story, this gent, but I'm sure with a bit of searching, we could find out. And
the good reminder for anyone watching is that all the churches pretty much in the world that have a Commonwealth War grave within them have a green plaque on the entrance to the church somewhere saying Commonwealth War grave. So you can always find, we found a couple ourselves out today on our research trip for another show. So they're easy to spot, and then you can go inside, and often it's a pilot or or an infantryman or whatever. And the general rule is if a British or Commonwealth serviceman has been buried within consecrated church ground, they don't usually move the body after the war. Not exclusively, sometimes they were moved, but usually if they've been buried within church ground, they stay there. That's for the Commonwealth. Americans were different, Germans were different, but for the British and Canadian, that was normally the way. So there you are. There's a typical sign you would normally see. So his liaison role that day ended in his death, sadly. So that's one man's war that you're writing about, but it was a very short war. But that doesn't mean it's any less significant, because some people served 5 years and didn't have a scratch. Some people died in the first minutes in a landing. So all stories are important. And again, we appreciate the work you've done. So have you any idea where it was he was killed, where, in the village you're at? Was it near the road, do you think?
Well, it's only down to speculation, unfortunately. It was most likely probably going to be on one of the little narrow country lanes near here. I don't think he would have been driving down the main road. And with the presence of the 12th SS and the 21st Panzers here, he was probably a bit surprised and was probably cut down by them. And you've got a couple of other little monuments here in the town that relate to units that served in Operation Epsom and beyond.
So this is, for those watching, this is Moulins. So you'll find this on a map there, and these areas were fought over, in late June, and lot serious list of names there.
Yes. 15th Scottish took quite a lot of casualties.
Yeah, it wasn't 28th of June was a bad day at the office for a lot of British Army units, wasn't it?
The D-Day history as well. Nearby, a Typhoon pilot was killed nearby here. An Australian.
Yeah.
Let's move on. It's a lovely little place and overlooked for history, I think. Most of Epsom is.
Well, we'll let you move on to your last location, which is a bit of a drive. So we're ducking you out because we'll bring Colin in to talk about poetry soon, generally. And so bear with us. And thanks for what you've been doing, Lloyd. And it's all good stuff. So I think Colin is with us now. So how you doing, Colin?
I'm all right.
It doesn't seem 5 minutes since I last saw you because it was only about, what, an hour and a half ago.
Yeah, it must be at least 90 minutes, yes.
Yeah, so Colin, for those watching, he joins in some of our shows as both cameraman and historian and a research assistant and everything and above, and another established battlefield guide in Normandy, but also something of a poet, Mr. Taylor. So one of your many bow skills to your career there. So war poetry, it's an interesting subject, and the reason I brought you on is Lloyd's driving, and I frankly don't know that much about poetry. So we tend to think with regards to war poetry of the First World War. So just as a bit of introduction, remind our viewers, some of the big hitters in the First World War and what they brought to history.
Well, the reason we think of the First World War as a poetry war is simply because there is this myth of from the plain fields of Eton to the battlefields of France. But nobody ever states that you came from the shipyards of Sunderland to the killing fields of France, or from the coal mines of Gateshead to the killing fields of Flanders, because it's all this middle class, that poetry is inaccessible. And it's a lack of education that was available to the working classes in the interwar period. So because university education is denied to people like would have been denied to people like myself. And poetry is an anathema. And the way poetry is taught in schools just turns people off poetry because it's badly taught. We are just rammed with the Shakespearean sonnets. We're rammed with the First War poets. When you talk about World War poetry, what people mean is the poetry of the First War. It doesn't mean it's bad. The poetry of the First War is absolutely wonderful. And if you bother to read the collections of the First War poetry, you will see that people like Rupert Brooke in 1914 is writing that it's such a wonderful thing to go to war, to fight for England. He doesn't use the word Britain, he uses the word England. But if you look at Brooke, who dies in 1915, by the time he's coming towards what will be his death, that whole thing changes. He's not now writing that it's a wonderful thing to die for England. He's writing about, this is shit. Why are we here? But all of the big hitters, Sassoon and Owen, are all public school boys. The only writer who's often ignored, and I think is one of the best writers in the First War in poetry, is Isaac Rosenberg, who refused promotion to Lance Corporal because he wanted to remain a private and true to what he was. And they take from the First War and that change about the banality of life in the trenches. And there is an awful lot of humor in poems, certainly from Sassoon, who's a very humorous poet. But if you read Sassoon, you'll find that there's an awful lot of pathos and sadness behind the poetry that he uses. And there's one called Plan of Attack, which is written as an incredibly humorous poem. It's called The General, actually, not Plan of Attack, it's called The General. It's a really humorous poem, but if you look behind the lines, because the last line is, the soldiers are all laughing and joking about how well he spoke, and one of the soldiers is called Jack, which ends the poem. And then there's a little ennui at the end, which just says, he did for them all with his plan of attack. And it is that just sums up the First War. Now, you move into the Second War, and it's not a war of poetry. It's a war of prose, because it's a much more working class front line. Whereas in the First War, you've got an awful lot of people from the public schools, the Harrows, the Eatons, and Shrewsbury School, which is where Owen went to, who fought with the Manchesters. They are the middle and upper classes. But in the Second War, the front lines, the poets of the time, yes, they served, but they tend to be mostly in rear echelons or in intelligence or at Bletchley Park. And they will write about the war after the war, not during it. There's very few you can look at in the war. Now, if you take, for example, the humorous magazines that the troops created during World War II, the regimental magazines, the company magazines, which were just to lift the spirits, there's an awful lot of poetry in them if you can find it. But you can't find it because these have just been lost over the years. I'm sure there is archives of many of these things, which is a carry on from the First War, where there will also be an awful lot of humorous poetry, lampooning generals and so on and so forth. Now, my biggest bugbear about poetry in general, not just war poetry, is it's badly taught. There are barriers, because poetry is an art form, and it's a wonderful art form, and it should be, and it is accessible to everybody. But people who want to protect this thing, that you're not allowed to read this because you're a working class bloody oik, so you can't understand poetry because you've not got the intelligence, which is the kind of interwar period, because we were denied education as working class people. But they put terms on things. Now, for example, long time before the First War, you look at people like John Donne, and who's a marvelous poet, by the way, not my favorite, but a marvelous poet. And people will say things like, he's a metaphysical poet. Now, when you're being taught No Man is an Island by John Donne, and people are saying he's a metaphysical poet, and you're 14, 15 years old, how the hell are you supposed to get your head around what a metaphysical poet was? You can't. And so automatically you shut down and you ignore it, and you lose such a wonderful, wonderful art form that you close off against. And that is the biggest bloody problem with teaching poetry in the language of Shakespeare and all of that.
Well, we've had this discussion at the pub in one of our Guinness sessions at the pub, you know, when we talk about Shakespeare and the accessibility of it. When you're reading it and being taught it, it can often be dry and boring. When you see it on stage, suddenly it lifts it, and you can see the passion and what actors bring to it. And I think the same with poetry, or the delivery. It's all in the delivery as well. I mean, for folks watching, we're going to be playing you, we're going to treat for you later, we're playing you one of Geraint's poems. And Nick Aaron, who's a buddy of ours, who was Popeye Wynne in Band of Brothers, who was a proud Welshman, grew up in the same valley as Richard Burton. Now, there's a claim to fame. Yeah. Kindly read me the poem last night. He's got a bit of a cold at the moment, Nick, but he did a fantastic job. It's just a minute and a half. I'll play it later on. And when I sent him a text, I read it, and I kind of half got the poem. And then when you sent me the audio recording, I completely got the poem. And it's just because of that, the delivery.
It's the performance. It's the performance of poetry. But performance poetry didn't come in until punk hit the stage, really. Poetry is always looked upon as this dry, it's a book, it sells 20, 30 copies. Now, you go from World War I, where all the poets are famous because that's what people teach in schools. We talk about war poetry, we mean Owen, Sassoon, Rosenberg, and so on and so forth. Sitwell and all the others, and Kipling as well. Even Kipling, towards the end of the war, his poetry changed enormously from the pro to the anti. And he does one poem, it's just a 2-line couplet. I've got it written down here on a bit of paper. I'll have to put my glasses on, which makes me look very unattractive. But
no, you're still sexy, don't worry.
Thank you very much. But his 2-line couplet is, if my question why we died, tell them because our fathers lied. And he's talking about his own son, of course, at that time.
Yeah.
And
so Lloyd's going to be at the cemetery soon. So well, we might keep you on even when Lloyd's there. But what does poetry bring the student of war history? What can you learn from a poem that you can't learn from a war diary or a battlefield report?
Very interesting, because if you follow the W.H. Auden school, now Auden's a fantastic poet. The Night Train's one of the most wonderful poems ever written. But Auden believed that poetry achieved ultimately nothing. But then if you go to Grieve, who's a Scottish poet at the time of the Second War, but the problem is, poetry in the First War is written by people on the front lines. The poetry of the Second World War, apart from half a dozen, are written by people behind the lines and after the war, looking back, such as Dylan Thomas, the famous Welsh poet. Now, he was there when Swansea was blitzed in 41, but he didn't write anything about it until 47, which is Return Journey, which is a wonderful. He didn't write, it reads like poetry, it's lyrical like poetry, but it is a BBC screenplay basically that he wrote. He was medically unfit for frontline service, but it took him 6 years to write about what happened. It's just, there are so few frontline poets, and those that they were there were ignored. One of the most famous, of course, is Douglas, who was killed in Normandy on June 9th, I think.
And we will be doing a Keith Douglas show at some point in the future. I'm going to kind of wrap things up with you now, Colin. I mean, you know me. I think you could talk about this for 14 hours and I wouldn't get bored, because I love your passion that you bring for a subject that is something that I've got a Billy Bragg book of poetry. That's the last, and the book you gave me of yours, of course. And I'll put, if anyone's interested, I can give you the links to Colin's books and what have you. And great user of words, Colin. That's what you bring. But we're going to wrap things up because really Lloyd has got a fantastic. The sun is beginning to go down in Normandy. Now that's the fact. Now we're well into September now. So the shows are doing back in June and July, where it doesn't get dark till 11 o'clock. Things are very much changing now. So I'll keep you on the line in case I'm YouTube. I'll keep you on the case you want to bring you in for a couple of comments a bit later on, Colin. But that was extraordinary what you gave there. I knew you'd be good value. So we'll speak again, Colin. But I'll just go back to Lloyd now. So Lloyd, what a great image you've got there.
It is beautiful, but it's also topical, because in the photographs I sent you, do you see one of a bunch of white crosses, a small group of graves?
I will get that one up for you right now. There we go.
Because that's this field right here. This was an orchard, and this was the temporary cemetery location before the main cemetery of where I am, Saint Manvieux, Norrie, was made. And so Geraint is in one of those, because those are all 159th Infantry Brigade lads. And this field has obviously been turned into an agricultural field now. The orchard is gone, but there was a large hedgerow running up from the edge of the workers' buildings there in the cemetery, and that's where Geraint was initially buried. And of course, then later he was moved.
What we'll do now, Lloyd, is I'll let you walk in, and while you're walking, I'll play Nick Aaron's reading of Geraint's one of his poems. And as Colin was saying there, the thing about Geraint is he was writing from pretty close to the front line. So, he was one of those exceptions that Colin thought about, is someone who had actually seen combat. And this poem is clearly about, mortality. So while you're walking in, I'll play. Means we won't be able to see Lloyd's images while the video is playing a bit, but just enjoy this. It's very short, and
let me not see old age. Let me not hear the proffered help, the mumbled sympathy, the well-meant tactful sophistries that mock pathetic husks who were once strong and free, and in youth's fickle triumph laughed and sang, loved and were foolish, and at the close have seen the fruits of folly garnered, and that love tamed and encaged, stale into grey routine. Let me not see old age. I am content with my few crowded years. Laughter and strength and song have lit the beacon of my life. Let me not see it fade, but when the long September shadows steal across the square, grant me this wish, they may not find me there.
Well, that was a treat hearing Nick read that. And if you're watching this, thank you very much for doing that, Nick, despite your cold. It was an amazing job. So, Lloyd, it's all over to you to tell us more about where you are. So which cemetery you're at now, Lloyd? You're at...
I'm in Saint Manvieux Cemetery, just outside Chew. I'll butcher the names. My pronunciation of French place names is appalling.
Yeah, we'll do. Yeah, yeah.
And it's not too far from Bayeux. It's only about 20-25 minutes. It's not heavily visited, but it's a very interesting cemetery. Lots of individuals in the cemetery from Operation Epsom.
Yeah, it's mostly late June, isn't it? There's a few early and a few later, but it's very much that late June period, isn't it?
Exactly, yes. But it's one
lovely
of my
sky
favorite
in front of you there, Lloyd. What an amazing sky.
Oh, yes. Even before I was interested in Geraint to this degree, it was one of my favorite cemeteries because of its layout, its size. But yeah, we're coming up to where Geraint is now, and we have quite a lot of his lads in here as well. Herefordshires. These were lads of the 11th Armoured Division in 159th Brigade. In fact, that's what Peter was. Peter was in the Herefords.
And so we didn't talk about, we mentioned Peter earlier, but Peter is the friend of Geraint from whom you got the extra information. You were struggling to find information, and then you found Peter's diaries, and then that was kind of with the beginning of the eureka moment of finding out some more information. I mean, but you're not finished yet. You're still digging and looking. You were looking at the museum down in the Bluecoat area in Normandy a few weeks ago and finding some more things there. So the quest never ends in this case. And you visit Geraint's grave, you said to me the other day, what, once or twice a week or something? You're up here all the time, aren't you?
Yeah, I like to come here occasionally and just, I like to read his poem over and over again at his grave. And I like to replace a little photograph and a copy of the poem, because unfortunately, I think the gardener got a little bit chop happy with the lawnmower and destroyed it recently. So we'll put a new one down.
If you'd like to read the other poem there, Lloyd, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, I will do in a second, surely. But yeah, Peter was a stroke of luck. I was posting all over the internet trying to find information about Geraint. Initially, I just wanted a photograph, but once I got that letter, his last letter from Normandy, which will be in the book, because I've got a copy of it, I wanted more. And at the same time, because of the quarantine, Ian Andrews, Peter's son, was looking for more information himself, and he happened to punch Geraint's name into Google, and up came a thread on an army forum that I'd posted, and all of a sudden I had 5 or 6 photographs and about 80,000 words of a memoir, and full of letters and diaries and all sorts, which painted a picture of Geraint in far more detail than I could have ever found myself, because there is nothing out there really. We have his records and that's about it.
So would you like to read the poem now then for us, Lloyd, and then we'll kind of draw things to a show, because we've been a bit longer than I thought we were going to be. Not that it's been bad, it's been a good show, but then we'll kind of wind things up. So
this poem inspired the name of the book that I'm writing, Your Peace is Bought with Mine, and also the inscription upon his grave that his parents chose. And the name of the poem is The Light of Day. And it goes, the light of day is cold and grey, and there is no more peace. By the high white moon-washed walls where we laughed and where we sung. And I can't go back to those days of short unthinking ease, when I was very foolish and you were very young. For you, the laurel and the rose will bloom, and you will see the dawn's delight, firelight on rafters, wind, seas, and thunder. Children asleep and dreams and hearts at ease, when life will be, even at its close, a quiet and ageless wonder. For me, the poppies soon will dance and sway in Otaven. The sunrise of my love slides into dusk, its day untasted. Yet, as I lie, turf-clad, and freed of passion and of pain, I find my sacrifice of golden things not wasted. Your peace is bought with mine, and I am paid in full, and well, if but the echo of your laughter reaches me in hell.
Wow. So I'm bringing Colin again here to round things up. And Lloyd, this is a question for both of you. You know, Lloyd, you're the researcher, Colin, you're the poet. Do you think Geraint foresaw his mortality? I mean, that comes through to me in the poem. What do you read? What do you hear in those two poems, Colin? What do you?
Well, the one thing there's very few World War II poets who are publicised. Douglas gets most of the publicity because he's latched onto by the likes of Ted Hughes and Auden and Amos after the war, who build him up. But the one thing that is levelled at World War II poets is they wrote in a very detached style, and they all kind of have a nihilistic style. They foresee their own deaths in World War II. Whereas they foresee in World War I, they foresee the deaths of other people. If you see what I'm saying, the juxtaposition. We talk about the dead, but in World War II, they talk about their death.
Right.
So there is a distinct difference between the two styles of poetry. And that's certainly prevalent in Geraint Jones's poems. It's a small body of work, but it is there, a common theme throughout his work.
I mean, Lloyd, what's your take? What is there in Peter's diaries about Geraint's personality? Do you know, was he moody? Was he reflective? Was he outgoing? Was the poetry part of him, or was it? Or what's your? I mean, there may be questions you don't know the answer to, but what's your? You know, you've got to know this man about as well as anybody possibly could. 76 years on. What's your take on that?
He's very outgoing, and one of the little anecdotes that I'll be including in the book is a little unpublished poem that Geraint wrote on the fly, and it's just a humorous limerick. And so poetry was definitely a big part of Geraint's life. He was a very fun-loving and joyful individual, but his poetry, it is very dated in the way it's written, its style. And he did write the poems, in fact, before he came to Normandy. He wrote them in early 1944 when he was in his training. And so I guess that he felt that it was his job to write poetry as the generation before him had done in World War I. His father was in World War I and no doubt inspired his service in World War II. So, yes, he was definitely a joyful individual.
But that doesn't mean he didn't write poetry in Normandy that he wrote on the back of fag packets and threw away. We have no idea, of course. He had a very short career in Normandy. You know, Colin would always say that once you're a poet, you're always a poet. So you're like an artist is always seeing landscapes with a visionary aspect of how you'd paint it. I'm guessing because Colin, when we go out, you see things in a very poetic way. When you use words in a way that perhaps I don't and Duncan doesn't. So a poet is a poet. Is that what when you're born? When you become a poet, you're a poet till you die. Are you on board with that?
Can I just say that poets do not write poems on the fly. They tear their words out of themselves. They do, because it's the self-editing that every writer goes through, whether he be a poet, a novelist, a dramatist, or a historian writing a book. It's not easy. And you are I've written thousands upon thousands of poems. How many end up in the basket, how many end up in a book is, it's a 1 to 20 chance that you end up in the bin. This is not on the fly. These will be torn from him. He will have worked and worked and worked and worked on those words to order them, to structure them. And you don't do this on the fly. We're not writing jingles.
Of course, the limerick I was referring to as well.
I think Lloyd means little limerick. So what we're suggesting is perhaps Geraint had about half a dozen poems that he was half through, that he was in the middle of working on in Normandy, that never quite got the time and space and to actually thrash them all out. And let's face it, even maybe in the middle of the front line, having enough paper to jot things down on. You have to write on the back of morning reports and what have you. Anyway, I've enjoyed what we've been doing. This kind of more intellectual look at World War II through the eyes of poetry. I think it's been quite revealing about some things, and I've enjoyed what we've done there. So Martin Harley is saying, how about a Colin poem before we finish?
Oh, no. Because I'll have to get up and go and bloody find one. I do have one I wrote for my grandfather about World War I. But I can't remember whether. Hang on, I might have it actually. There you go. I do.
I just so happen to have it here.
No, the thing is, I've got the printouts of my notes for the novel I'm working on at the moment about my grandfather in World War One, and I happen to have this one, which is called Rain, and it's about life in Flanders in 1917.
Go for it, Colin.
And it's rain, incessant rain. The soundtrack changes for the thickening morass, a landscape washed, a landscape drowning, deeper, deeper sinking, sucking from the soul. I fear the spring offensive, with each stumbling step rising damp withers the colours of such landscape desolate. We laid waste this land, scattered it with dreams. Will they conserve this ugliness, this morass of stinking brown? Or come ye artists of the future, prepare your palettes to paint our death on sweet nature's return. So there you go.
Thank you very much, Colin. You actually got a little tear to my eye there, because I know you and I know how you feel about your family. So I'll let Lloyd back on again, because we've pushed him aside a bit, but so that's a bit rude of me. So Lloyd, you've done a fantastic job there telling Geraint's story, and I feel we've not finished yet with your research work, and maybe we'll come back and do a second part sometime in the future when you've got maybe further, or when you've got the book finished. But that was a nice little show. I thought maybe 30, 45 minutes. We've done nearly an hour, but what the hell, if people are enjoying it, there's people watching it who have enjoyed it. So
I noticed, can I just say, I noticed Martin put on earlier that he's a half a Jones, and there's no J in the Welsh alphabet. The name Jones is not Welsh. It's actually from the Somerset Marshes. And I know that because my maternal family are Joneses as well. And they are Welsh. They do hail from the Swansea Gower area. And I still have family there. But if you're a Jones, you're not technically Welsh. You're from the Somerset Marshes.
Well, there's a debate for a future show. But so Lloyd, incredible work. Thank you very much. That was a really informative show.
Lloyd.
Thank you.
So I think we'll bring things around fairly shortly. So in terms of housekeeping, what we've got coming up, it's absolutely busy schedule coming up over the next few weeks. So I've got lots of things coming up, both some live streams from battlefields and also some panel discussions and things like that as well. So tomorrow we're into Holland in the afternoon with Frank Gubbles and Kevin Hemel talking about the 30th Division arriving into Holland. Then we've got Linda joining us on Saturday for the story of the Black Medic at Omaha Beach, Waverley Woodson. We've got Colin is joining Duncan is joining us, our other cameraman live. Colin might be there as well from Omaha Beach on the morning of Sunday, the 13th. That's like midnight 30 for a live report from Omaha Beach in the middle of the night about Operation Aquatin. That'll be a cool one. I'm looking forward to that one myself. As always, check out the Patreon page. We could do with some donations to help us move things through, and check out the links. You can find information about Colin's tours, and you could even do a poetry tour with Colin of the First World War battlefields. He'd love that. Oh yeah. Lloyd is also a tour guide as well. And Lloyd's Facebook page. Get in touch with Lloyd if you've got information about the Welsh units in Normandy, or poetry, or the Monmouthshire or 11th Armoured Division. Lloyd would be gratefully receive any more information about his subject there. And but as for me, I think it's been a great show. So Lloyd, thank you very much. You can go back and see your dog now. You've done sterling work.
Cheers, Colin.
Colin, as usual,
pleasure.
Attraction. So brilliant. I will say good night, folks, and end the stream there, and join us again in World War II shortly. So thank you very much. I'm Paul Woodadge from World War II TV saying, see you later, guys.